Okay, let's talk about Inferno. This is the third volume in the Levian campaign series, a series that I'm pretty much all in on and enjoy all the games of, including this one. However, the elephant in the room is, look, I played it twice and didn't get, well, and got an unsatisfactory experience both times for various reasons. The first time I played this, I screwed something up, and there's a lot of things about this particular game in the series that make it more possible to screw things up than other games in the series. I screwed something up, and the game ended pretty damn early. That's something that can happen in Levian Campaign. It's quite possible. The system gives you enough things that aren't terribly intuitive that you can really, really royally mess up. And there are some little edge cases in the system as a whole that make it quite possible for you to like lose the game very, very quickly. I was more careful the second time I played, but I got to a point where the information overload, along with maybe the style of how I play and whatnot, got me into a position where I fucked up a bunch of rules in the last turn or two of the game. And, you know, it was just at a point where I couldn't see going on. And that gets to, I think, the key point, something that I brought up just on reading the rules, basically, in the introduction, which is that this is the most burdensome of an already burdensome series, and already a series that's different enough in a lot of ways that your likelihood of screwing up just based on what the series is, you know, if you're a long-time wargamer for the most part, right? You know, if you're approaching wargaming as a fairly new hobby, you may be very used to very different concepts coming out in play all the time. But this is, and it's really one of the things that makes the series shine so much for me, is that the Levian campaign system is very different from anything else that I've ever seen. And for the most part, seems to cover things in a way that works in a type of warfare that hasn't been adequately covered before. I'm not going to go into the whole spiel about, you know, why I love the series, or, you know, even though I kind of avoided it in the intro too. Going into the specifics of, going into the general rules of the series, and instead looking at just the specific changes that this went. And that was kind of a disaster, to tell you the truth. In fact, everything I've done with this has been a disaster. One thing I think I did manage to mention in the intro, but I want to highlight again. Somebody had written down worst rules ever and rated it like a 1 or a 2. I think a 1 based on that. Maybe a 2. I don't think that's fair. The Levian came. First of all, I know it's not fair because I've dealt with games that are just horrendous rules. But there is something specific about the rules to all the Levian campaign games that is somewhat problematic, which is that the rules and the cards tend to be very, very sparse, very parsimonious in their, and in a weird sort of way. In a way that you could very easily mistake the intent of the role. Now, in previous games, well, at the very least in Almoravid, but I suspect Nevsky is the same. I played it, it was long enough ago, I don't really remember terribly much, but everything that I looked up, I could eventually figure out what was meant. It was usually a matter of the wording choices were just a little weird in order to save, you know, a space here or there, a couple of characters, whatever. maybe a word or two even, in such a way that like left you not as certain about what the rule meant when you first read it, and you'd have to go back and maybe look at it a little harder. There weren't any real ambiguities that I can remember from Almoravid. In this one, I found some where that style of writing maybe didn't suit. So there's two authors to this. One is Volko, and one is Enrico Acerbi. And Volko's style may not have worked as well with this other designer. And he tried to fit to it, but whatever happened, there were a couple of cases where I don't feel like the kind of precision that Volko usually puts into his games was as present here. For whatever reason, left or right. This game also adds a lot more complexity and a lot more game state to analyze than the previous games did. And one place where there is additional complexity is on the map board itself, where it has these littler shields. They got the big shields, so those are your normal lord shields. These are your vassal shields, and they have an important impact on the levy system, where the vassals actually come from. In addition, the board itself was shrunk down, smaller than any other. There's more information, I think, on the board, certainly more per square inch by far, and the calendar in this game has to hold a larger number of service markers than other calendars do in the system, just because there's more vassals in this, which means that the fact that that's kind of smaller and tighter fit in 2 rows instead of 1, whatever, it's harder to get all of the materials that you need on the board. The space between locations is a little tighter because of the shrinking of the board. And the fact that there is a lot of information on the board means that that combination means that the counters that you need to have on the board end up covering up information that you kind of need to know and see. So the amount of game state is actually higher, and the amount of space to present it is smaller. This is one of the things that I feel caused me some of my issues. Probably the biggest one. Others, though, are that this particular instance of the game has, I think, more complicated systems overall. Now, in both the rule book and in a viewer's comment, there was kind of the argument of, well, supply is easier in this game. It's easier to come by supply. It's a richer area. You can get supplies more easily. But I feel like the decision making that you're making is exactly the same kind of difficult decision making that you make throughout the Levian campaign series in terms of supplies, which is to say, you don't want to waste turns grabbing supplies that you don't need or can't hold, which means that you're always going to be trying to cut it, fairly fine as to how much supply that you need and that you're going to make during your planning phase. So I don't feel like the planning is particularly easier. You just maybe have to take less supply turns, or account for less supply turns. But you can't just kind of say, supply doesn't matter, I can get it everywhere. You can't. And in fact, you're limited by the number of carts and by the distance and all that kind of stuff. So you end up I feel making the same kind of difficult calls that you do throughout the series. I don't think it lightens up there in any significant sort of way. Now, the game does add a few things that I really want to touch on that make for significant differences in the game. The first one is, and the components other than the map, everything is pretty much the same as in every other game of this series. So don't worry. You can look at the others. I would say stay away from this one as your first choice. Even if this is the topic that interests you the most and you've been waiting to buy the series until this particular game came out, go with one of the others first, because this one has the heaviest learning curve and the highest burden on the players, I think. It adds concept of treachery, which is expressed in a couple of ways. Treachery cards, which you can put into your programming, they're hard to get into your programming in the sense that you can't be certain whether or not you're going to be able to use them. Like a lot of times, you're programming your movement and your supply options and your sieges and whatever battles you might want and whatever. And it's hard to tell whether or not you're going to be able to use a treachery card. So they become kind of difficult to add into your deck. It seems more valuable to me to add something in that you're going to get to use. Emotionally, I have a difficulty in expending something, and those cards are actually gone until you recharge them, the treachery cards. Unlike your regular command cards, which you can always use. Treachery cards you only get through the treachery mechanisms, which, sometimes it's very hard to predict whether or not you're going to be able to use the card where you think you're going to use it in your sequence. So I found them a little less useful than I had hoped. The other thing related to treachery is revolts. There's a couple of factors that can trigger possible revolts and gaining of treachery cards. Trying to think. Permanently disbanding beyond the service limit, which usually permanently gets rid of a leader, will generate treachery. I'm trying to think. Winning sieges or storms, which whether or not you assault during a siege is, I consider the whole thing the siege. Winning a city through siege will gain you both revolt rolls and treachery rolls. There may be something else. There's also possibilities through cards that these can be triggered through events and whatnot. For the revolt table, you roll a couple of dice on here on something that's kind of the rules. One of the many issues, and I'm not going to go into it. One of the many places where I feel like something's kind of weird. You have revolt against the Ghibellines and revolt against the Guelphs, and the rules kind of say roll on your table when it's actually roll on the against table of the other player. So it's pretty clear that's what's in that the intent is different from how it reads, but that should be cleared up in the errata, actually. Definitely one of the cases that caught me. But you roll, you get a city, and there's a possibility, depending on the circumstances on the board, that city will revolt. It's also possible another city may revolt, or you may get something that triggers cities that aren't listed in the revolt table that the other player owns that will end up revolting. You don't have a lot of control over this, but if you can get tendrils into the other player's territory, and you start out with such, you can immediately get sort of a domino effect by sieging a city, other locations, a city, castle, whatever. Other locations might fall to you as well. I'm looking at this because I think the table of contents will help me the most to finding what's going on here. Oh, that's a little different. So you have podesti, which are the mayors of the of the towns and cities, which are a different kind of lord. And unlike the normal lords, they can't be permanently disbanded. And then each player has a special podesta who is the mayor of their main city. And that, all the podesta have some special rules. First of all, they can't be destroyed by being over service. Some other mayor will get elected or whatever. The population still supports its city-state in a way that's different from the rest of the series. Another is, even if that city's under siege or town is under siege that has a podesta, it's possible to levy the podesta within that town. There are also leaders who have multiple seats, and it's possible to levy these leaders in their secondary seat. In the case of podestae, if they're being levied in a secondary seat, it costs more. So again, another little grinding point where, like, it's easy to come up with errors. I made lots of mistakes throughout my play. During the levy phase, the call to arms in this is different from what the other systems. It has a more complex call to arms system, which is basically, generally it's triggered by the two players having a great disparity in victory points. And then the person who's losing is able to start a more general war. And that brings additional forces into play. It brings a capability to bring forces together at the primary city, and it gives you an additional muster of a lord, it gives you an additional chance to muster a lord who's not in play yet, or a chance to do levy actions with a lord in addition to whatever you did earlier in the game, or earlier in the levy turn, which means that you're going to have a lot of forces on the board when there's a call to arms, when one's called. And there's no real limit to how many of these can happen, which means you could get destroyed in a major battle and then basically rebirth the next turn, as long as you're capable of doing the call to arms. There are a couple of cards that allow you to do call to arms as well, and there may be other circumstances that do. There's like 4 bullet points that allow you to. The big one, though, is that the point spread is far apart, and again, cards. Trying to think what else is particularly odd in this one. The victory points for ravaging, and it's also possible when you storm a location, it gets turned into a ruins. Now these can be rebuilt at great expense, but when you storm a location, a marker goes in it for ruins, which causes victory points against the original owner of the location, no matter whose castle you just destroyed. The original owner takes the penalty, essentially, or the non-original owner gets a bonus in victory points in reality, but same thing. And ravaging is also applied only against the original owner. Now, the original owner isn't necessarily the person who started the scenario with it. It's based on essentially a borderline that crosses the map entirely. It's also marked by the color based on the size of the location, which is how many victory points the area is worth. Those ruin markers also provide victory points for the person who is not the original owner. Which means you start off with some territories that are your own, that are considered yours, and that you don't want to destroy or ravage, but that are owned by the other player at the beginning of the campaign scenario. And so you kind of don't really want to storm them. I didn't do a single storm. I came close a couple of times, but my knowledge of the system as a whole is such that storming is very painful to the player who does it. Like, you end up losing a lot of troops when you do a storm. And I felt like I needed to keep a field army even though if your field army gets destroyed, you might be able to bring it back through the call to arms system. Um, so I was very, very leery of actually risking my forces in a storm, and I feel like this my plays previously have convinced me to kind of stay away from that because it's fairly easy to get a city to surrender. And there's advantages to it. And in this one in particular, you don't rubble the location if you take it by surrender, which means that you still have that location, and that you gain that location, and you get all the advantages supply-wise and whatnot, and preventing the other player's supply of having those fortresses. So I kind of stayed away from storming cities. It felt like there were a lot of disincentives in this one. Not just cities, castles even, whatever. It's fairly easy to take things between treachery and surrender and whatnot. There are a lot of opportunities for that. This also has knights being ransomed, which I feel is a valuable and interesting little capability or aspect of the game to track. It doesn't quite work the way I'd expect it to. Notably, if you lose a battle, at least the way the rules are written, if you lose a battle, sure, you might have a higher chance of your knights being captured. But the loser of the battle may also capture knights. And he can even do it if he's completely wiped out by the battle, or if he has to retreat, sort of the uncontrolled route situation, where you didn't withdraw from the battle or anything. That feels completely wrong to me. The chances are pretty much the same, except that if you suffer that uncontrolled rout, you have a much, much higher chance of your forces just being eliminated, which is throughout the system. And maybe a slightly higher chance of knights being captured. But for the most part, I felt like the knight capture system needs some work on it. It just doesn't work quite the way I think it should. And you can look at the playthrough if you want to see what the results of it are. But yeah, I mean, it was quite possible that the loser of the battle might capture more knights than the winner, and it just doesn't feel right. And maybe I'm mistaking something. I don't think so. I think I'm playing it as it's intended, and I just don't think that works terribly well. There's a much larger number of vassals in the game. It's also possible through the treachery mechanism. So there's two things you can do with the treachery cards. One of them is to try to get cities to come over to your side. That doesn't cause any kind of additional domino effect, but that can be very valuable, and you can maybe plan for that a little better than you can plan for the other mechanisms of using treachery. The other mechanism of using treachery is to use it against either an opponent's vassal seat. Good luck finding those. I mean, they're all over the map, but it's hard to tell what you're going for. If the vassal isn't mustered, and again, there's an information overload here, or if you move up next to where that vassal actually is, deployed with his lord, you can muster, you can try to get him to switch sides. And that can happen, basically not right before a battle, but close enough to one where it can make a big difference. This means that the vassal service markers end up on other players' cards. I think it's an important aspect to capture in the game, but again, it's another heavy burden in terms of the amount of information that's there and the amount of stuff you have to be able to be aware of and to see how you can get these traders, basically. If cities, this is just kind of something I missed thinking about it, but in terms of the big things. If a city ends up going over due to treachery, certainly due to the revolt table, but maybe treachery as well. But let's just say due to the revolt table, the person who just lost that location gets additional service, essentially. They can move service markers in their favor, or they can move their own cylinders in their favor, which shows like an influx of additional like people who are unhappy with where their location went to. And that again is an interesting little piece of the puzzle. But again, it adds to the burden in terms of what's moving around and what's not, and being able to predict what's likely to happen. I felt like it was too much for me, at least in the state of mind that I was in playing it, and the nature of who I am right now and whatnot. I felt like I was really, and obviously, I fucked up both times I played. The first time I fucked up in a way that made one side lose the game when they could have prepared not to, and the other time I just fucked up a series of rolls, maybe because I was too sleepy and in a rush or whatever, but a whole lot went wrong. Maybe I just caught things that went wrong. Maybe I was actually sharper than I usually am. I don't know, But I think that the game, the additional burden of this particular incarnation of the system was a little too much for me to cope with. But doesn't mean that I dislike it. Doesn't mean that, I don't think it's a good game. I just felt very frustrated by what happened. And that's going to come through in the playthrough where I seem more angry or upset or whatever. And I'm really angry with me more than anything else. If you're already playing the games of this series and like them and play them a lot, I don't think you're going to have any problem being able to incorporate this. That extra burden is going to be like, when traditional war games started getting more complex, right? But it could be that something, that maybe it's pushing the limits of this system a little closer to the edge of where people are going to be able to handle it. It might be the case that you're perfectly happy with the first two games in the series, and that this one won't, that this one will take away some of that sort of comfort space, and you may just not want to go into it. I don't know. I don't make that judgment for myself. Like, for myself, I feel like, yeah, I could get used to this. I could get used to the differences here, and could get used to the increased game state that I have to track. But it was very frustrating under the conditions that I was playing it. I feel like there's something else I wanted to say. I don't know what it is. I'm looking forward to the next one in the series, and that's about it, I guess. I don't know.